Plants are all around us, but not all plants are equally common. In fact, many species have been declining so rapidly in recent decades that they're now considered threatened. But how many species are at risk? What are the causes? And what can we do as individuals to help conserving them? We spoke with Dr. Rachel Gallagher from Western Sydney University in Australia. Rachel has dedicated her career to understanding the causes of plant species decline and finding ways to conserve them. Rachel, how many plants around the world are currently facing risk of extinction?
Oh, that's a great question. Too many, I would say. And the reason I always give that answer is because it's quite complicated. Because it depends which methods that you use to assess species. So there's more than 350,000 plant species in the world. Obviously, we can't go one by one through those species, doing an individual assessment of extinction risk for each one. And so a lot of the time we're using methods that kind of estimate how many species might be at risk of extinction. So there might be species that have particular life history strategies, or like different growth forms, or different sizes of their geographic range. And we use that kind of information to feed into models so that we can then model the extinction risk probability. And so there was a recent study that looked at this question and came up with a figure of 45% of species. So 45% of 350,000 or so species is a huge number of plants which could potentially be at risk of extinction. If we look at something more formal, like the IUCN Red List, so the International Union for the Conservation of Nature have a standardized protocol for assessing species called the Red List criteria. And when we look at the Red List criteria and all of the 70,000 or so plant species which have been assessed, against those criteria, about 40% of them are considered at risk of extinction. So somewhere in the order of 30,000 species. So that's a lot that have had that one-by-one species assessment done. And then when we think about getting down to what happens at the national level, like here in Australia, we have laws, environmental laws, where we assess each individual species for its extinction risk. And if it's deemed threatened, it then becomes a matter of national environmental significance under our Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. And under the Act, we can regulate threats that impact upon the species. And currently there are 1,472 plant species that are listed as threatened or extinct in Australia.
These are amazing numbers. What are the most common factors contributing to the threat or extinction even of plant species?
Yeah, great question too. So I tend to think of like the threats being grouped into two major kind of categories, and those are kind of human-driven categories. So things like land clearing, for instance, for agriculture, for urbanization, for other human uses is probably the primary driver of extinction risk, both in Australia and across the world. So basically just taking away habitat that would otherwise be occupied by plants. But then also in that category are things that are driven by human activities like anthropogenic climate change. And so the changes in temperature and rainfall, extreme events such as drought and fire, driving changes in the regimes that support species across their range. And then there's other kinds of threats which are like biological threats. So in that category, I'd think of things like disease or feral animals. And, diseases in Australia are things like Phytophthora, which is a root rot fungus, or myrtle rust, which affects species in the Myrtaceae. So, and I think it's important when we think about threats to not just think about individual threats acting on species, because most species have multiple threats that are acting at the same time and interacting with each other, and their effects are being compounded together. So yeah, it's really a multifaceted kind of question to understand which threats are impacting species.
Along those lines, from a research standpoint, what are the key questions we need to explore better to understand plants that are at risk, or to assess species at risk?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, mainly because I think sometimes they're not necessarily biological research questions or ecological research questions, because those threats that I talked about are really human driven, we need to understand the motivations around human use of the world's resources. We need to understand what motivates landholders to engage in conservation or to engage in restoring habitat on their land. And we need to kind of spatially plan those things together so that we can understand, for any given location, how do we optimize the decision that's made by someone who owns that land? How do we decide what should be done with a parcel of land? And, you know, we have a finite amount of terrestrial space in the world. There's, you know, only a certain amount of land for which people and plants can coexist. And so trying to decide what's the optimal way of making sure plant populations are reintroduced into the landscape, not just put in seed banks and sort of left to have a one-day kind of approach to reintroducing plants out into the field. We need to kind of start to think about how to reintroduce populations and where to put them and where socioecologically is the best place to put them.
Mm. And at an individual level, is there any steps, practical steps, whatever, that anyone can take right now to help protecting endangered plant species?
Oh, that's really cool. I like being asked things like this because I always think it is really about community engagement and getting people really fascinated in the plants that occur in their areas where they live. So spending time in the bush, it's very important. Sometimes I'm shocked at how few people, Australians, I see out walking in the bush. If it was anywhere in Europe or other parts of the world, it'd be full of people enjoying the natural environment. So yeah, really getting acquainted with things that are around you. Getting involved in things like land care groups and local bush regeneration projects where you can really tackle some of the threats to species like weed invasions or fencing out feral animals. And also, yeah, just talking about plants with other people as well. The conversation in conservation in Australia is really around animals a lot of the time. It's really about things like, which are very worthy, things like the cause of the koala or platypus, really high profile species, but it's the plants that form the foundations of those habitats that those animals depend on. So I think it's really important that we, work to understand plants as well. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. And for students, students interested in studying ecology, is there any advice you could give for early career researchers who want to find probably their space in this, you know, like in plant ecology and conservation of species?
I'm full of advice about these things. I think follow your passion, which sounds very trite to a lot of people, I guess, but I really do mean it. If you can be propelled forward by your love of nature and your love of plant life, and that is at the core of why you do things, then, you know, it will always make you want to get up in the morning and get to work and keep at your research. Everyone fails, you know, at every career stage. And there's a lot of people who may not admit that, but it's really important to know when you're starting out and you're trying to make that hard transition from being an early career researcher to getting your first academic post that, it's going to take a lot of persistence. And also be kind and be ethical. I think it's really important to know where you stand from an ethical standpoint when you're being asked to review grants or review people's PhD theses or their papers. Yeah, always having a good core within about what's right and what's not right.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much, Rachel.
Yeah, thanks, Julie.